You are standing in the year 1315. The skies above much of northern Europe are grey and swollen with endless rains. For 2 years, the crops have failed, and the earth is heavy with mud instead of wheat. The period historians later named the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was not just a failure of agriculture, it was the slow unraveling of communities, the testing of every household, and above all, the weight of survival falling most heavily on the shoulders of women. The Middle Ages are often remembered for knights in armor, castles rising above the countryside, and the grandeur of kings. But famine strips away grandeur. When rains destroyed harvests and livestock starved in their pens, it was not the nobility who bore the hardest blows, it was the peasants, and within those families, the women. They were the ones who had to answer a child's cry for bread, even when there was no bread to give. They were the ones who stretched grain into something resembling a meal, who traded dignity for survival, who decided how to portion out hunger. Let us begin in a small village in Flanders, where rain has ruined the rye fields 3 harvests in a row. The grain rots in storage, infested with mold. Cattle, unable to graze on waterlogged pastures, fall sick. Salted fish, usually imported from the North Sea, is now so expensive that only the wealthiest townsfolk can afford it. For the average peasant family, there is nothing dependable left. The husband, if he is still alive and strong, may attempt to find day labor in a nearby town. But the towns themselves are suffering, and there is no work to be found. Many men wander or join the swelling ranks of beggars on the roadsides. Inside the home, the wife is left with children to feed and perhaps an aging parent or an infant at her breast. The daily burden of famine is domestic, it is about food, fire, and endurance. That is why famine was, in many ways, a woman's war. Women turned to measures that today sound both desperate and ingenious. In the absence of flour, they learned to grind acorns, chestnuts, and even the bark of trees into a coarse powder. This powder, mixed with what little rye or barley remained, could be baked into flat, heavy cakes. These so-called famine breads were bitter and often indigestible, causing cramps and sickness, but they gave the illusion of eating. The chronicles of the time mention villagers grinding dried ferns or mixing clay into dough, not because they thought clay was nourishing, but because it filled the stomach long enough to endure another night. Imagine a mother kneeling before a hand mill, her hands blistered from turning it hour after hour, grinding not wheat but oak bark she stripped from the trees on the edge of the forest. The bark is dried, scraped, and pulverized. When mixed with water, it becomes a paste, which she flattens into cakes on the hearthstone. Her children chew on it, grimacing, but at least they chew something. She knows that too much of it will weaken them further, yet the alternative, silence and empty mouths, is worse. And it was not only food that women had to manage. Fuel for cooking grew scarce, for wet wood would not burn. Dried dung, carefully collected in better years, became precious. Women rationed fuel just as they rationed bread. They simmered thin soups, stretching a handful of beans across several days by adding more water each morning. In many cases, these soups contained nothing more than nettles, sorrel, and cabbage leaves boiled into a bitter green liquid. The chronicles described scenes of women foraging by riverbanks for edible weeds, roots, and grasses. Nettles became a staple in some places, boiled to soften their sting. Dandelion roots were dug up and chewed raw. Even rats and dogs were eaten in the hardest-hit towns. Yet the act of foraging was not only about finding calories, it was about a mother's relentless duty to bring back something. Every handful of leaves, every root dragged from the soil, was proof of her determination not to surrender her family to starvation. We should also note the quiet exchange systems that women maintained during famine. Men might roam in search of coin, but women built webs of survival through barter. A few onions from one garden might be traded for a scrap of wool to repair clothing. A spoonful of salt, if one was lucky enough to still have it, could be swapped for a handful of beans. Women did this trading quietly, often in the lanes or at church steps, creating small lifelines between households. These transactions were not glamorous, they were acts of invisible diplomacy that held villages together. Yet, even as they bore this weight, women faced social judgment. In times of famine, desperation often forced women into choices condemned by the church. Selling their labor was not enough, some resorted to selling their bodies, exchanging intimacy for bread. Chroniclers, usually male monks, wrote scornfully of this, but they overlooked the harsher truth, that women did whatever they had to in order to keep children alive. Survival often demanded sacrifices that history later recorded only as shame. The famine also transformed women's roles in ways that historians are only now beginning to appreciate. In households where men died of hunger, war, or disease, widows became heads of families. They took over the plowing of fields, the repairing of roofs, the tending of animals. Villages that once confined women to domestic tasks suddenly depended on them for survival. In this sense, famine blurred the rigid gender lines of medieval society, at least temporarily. But famine also tested faith. Women were often the ones to lead prayers at the hearth, to guide children in fasting and penitence when the church declared days of prayer for rain to cease. Some women, accused of witchcraft, were blamed for the weather or for hoarding food. The burden of explanation, the why of famine, fell unequally, and women often absorbed that blame. The records of the Great Famine speak of tens of thousands dead, but behind those numbers are silent stories: mothers who cut their own rations to feed a child, grandmothers who walked miles to dig roots from frozen ground, wives who stood in line at monasteries hoping for a crust of bread distributed as charity. If famine is remembered as a natural disaster, we should also remember it as a human drama enacted most painfully within households. Even the smallest details mattered. Consider the use of salt. Salt was essential for preserving food, but during famine, supplies dwindled. Women learned to dry fish or meat without salt, often with disastrous results, as it rotted quickly. They attempted to smoke it over weak fires, using every twig and branch they could gather. Imagine the constant anxiety, that the little food one had might spoil before it could be eaten. Every decision became a gamble between hunger now and hunger tomorrow. And still, in the middle of this, women had to keep daily routines, mending clothes, caring for infants, nursing the sick. Famine was not an event that stopped life, it was life itself, stretched thin, demanding energy even when there was none. The rhythm of existence became one of searching, stretching, and hoping. So when we think of the Great Famine, we must think not only of failed harvests and rainy summers but of kitchens without flour, of hands grinding bark into powder, of women stirring thin soups with weary arms. These are not the heroic tales of medieval chronicles, but they are the truths that sustain survival. And yet, even in these bleak years, questions linger. Did these desperate strategies actually save lives, or merely prolong suffering? Were women's efforts enough to hold families together, or did famine tear them apart despite every sacrifice? And most importantly, how much of this quiet labor went unrecorded, hidden behind the walls of cottages, lost to history except for the bitter taste of famine bread? You have now seen how famine entered the home, pressing its weight onto the hands of women who stretched bark into bread and weeds into soup. But famine was never endured in isolation. Households did not survive alone, they survived, or perished, through networks of obligation, barter, and silent resilience. And within these networks, women were often the architects. When fields failed and markets emptied, entire villages had to reshape their social fabric. Men might discuss shortages in the fields or at the tavern, but it was women who quietly built the daily strategies that held communities together. In the lanes, at the church porch, or by the wells, women carried news of which household still had beans, which cow had survived, or which merchant had a little salt to sell. The famine became a map of whispered exchanges, and women walked its lines more than anyone else. Consider, for a moment, how barter functioned. In normal years, markets buzzed with coin transactions. A farmer sold surplus grain, a weaver sold cloth, a potter sold jugs. But during the famine, coin meant little when there was nothing to buy. What mattered was possession of even the smallest thing useful for survival. Women turned onions into currency, spinning wool into bread, and occasionally trading scraps of clothing for a handful of peas. One record from northern England describes a widow who traded her late husband's cloak for a sack of barley. To outsiders, the cloak seemed valuable; to her, it was merely heavy cloth against the promise of food. Another example comes from France, where chronicles note that women often exchanged dairy products, milk from a half-starved goat, curds from thin cheese, for firewood or beans. These transactions were small, yet they made the difference between an evening with something in the pot and one without. Even more important was the informal lending of food. Women often gave out small measures of grain or lent a loaf of bread with the unspoken expectation that it would be repaid when times were better. Such lending kept neighbors alive, but it also carried risk. If famine dragged on, repayment might never come. Resentments built, and communities frayed. But in many cases, this quiet system of female credit allowed entire parishes to stagger forward. The church, too, played a role, though it was often uneven. Monasteries were pressured to give alms, and women were frequently the ones who stood in line at convent doors, holding children by the hand, waiting for crusts of bread or thin pottage doled out from the kitchens. Chroniclers often described these scenes with pity, yet also with a certain distance, as if they could not see the individual labor of mothers bringing their families to beg for sustenance. Nuns sometimes emerged as allies. Women religious, accustomed to managing convent kitchens and gardens, had practical knowledge that mirrored the strategies of peasant wives. Some convents opened their gardens to villagers, allowing women to collect herbs or vegetables. In other cases, convent infirmaries treated the sick, especially children weakened by malnutrition. But the aid was limited, for convents themselves depended on donations that shrank as famine spread. In towns, women sometimes joined together in informal groups, pooling scraps to cook a communal pot of stew. The practice was not universal, but where it happened, it reduced the risk of one family starving alone. These collective pots, simmering with whatever greens or roots could be gathered, symbolized more than just food. They were acts of solidarity in a time when survival often narrowed people's horizons to their own households. Beyond barter and charity lay another form of survival, knowledge of the natural world. Women had long been the collectors of herbs and the keepers of garden plots. During famine, this knowledge became crucial. While men might despair at ruined fields, women scoured hedgerows and forest edges for plants overlooked in times of plenty. Nettles, wild garlic, chickweed, sorrel, and even young thistles became ingredients. Dandelion leaves provided bitter greens, while their roots could be boiled into something resembling coffee centuries before coffee itself reached Europe. Mushrooms, carefully selected, offered occasional nourishment, though mistakes could be deadly. Women often passed this knowledge to their daughters, teaching them how to distinguish edible plants from poisonous ones, a silent inheritance that rarely made it into written records. There is a revealing detail from a chronicle in Brabant, where famine-struck villagers survived on a paste made from pounded fern roots. The chronicler noted it with horror, but what he missed was the ingenuity behind it. Someone, likely women, had remembered or rediscovered a way to make an otherwise useless plant into something edible. These strategies may not have provided full nutrition, but they were acts of stubborn defiance against hunger. Yet, in the midst of ingenuity, there was also suspicion. Famine sharpened social tensions, and women were often caught in the middle. Accusations of hoarding or witchcraft sometimes surfaced. A woman who seemed to have food when others starved might be whispered about as having made a pact with dark forces. If she possessed unusual knowledge of herbs, she might be seen as dangerous rather than resourceful. There are scattered records of women punished for supposedly causing bad weather or for hiding grain. These accusations remind us that survival was not simply about finding food, it was also about navigating the fragile web of reputation. To survive, women needed not only skills but caution, ensuring that their resourcefulness did not appear as arrogance or sorcery in the eyes of desperate neighbors. Perhaps the heaviest toll of famine, though, was not physical but emotional. Chroniclers, being men of letters, rarely recorded the inner lives of peasant women. But we can glimpse their burdens in the decisions they faced, deciding which child received the last crust of bread, deciding whether to eat less themselves so others might live, deciding whether to beg, trade, or even sell their dignity for food. Imagine a mother holding a bowl of thin soup. There is just enough for 3 children, but she has 4. Does she divide it evenly, leaving all hungry, or does she favor the youngest, whose survival seems most fragile? These are choices unrecorded in official histories but lived out in countless cottages across Europe. Grief also weighed heavily. Women buried children weakened by hunger, often without coffins, sometimes in mass graves. They did so quietly, then returned to the tasks of survival because others still needed them. The resilience required was not loud or celebrated, it was steady, almost invisible, but it was the backbone of endurance. By 1317, when harvests slowly began to improve, Europe was scarred. Millions had died. Fields lay untended, villages had shrunk, and livestock herds were depleted. Yet those who survived owed their endurance, in large part, to the unrecorded labor of women. They had foraged, bartered, begged, and improvised. They had preserved life in small, unheroic increments. And yet, history did not reward them. The chronicles spoke of kings who organized grain imports, of priests who led prayers, of noble lords who opened their granaries. Rarely did they speak of the widow grinding acorns, or the mother trading milk for firewood. The famine passed, but the memory of women's strategies faded, surviving only in fragments of records and in folk traditions about famine breads and bitter herbs. Still, the question lingers, did famine subtly shift the balance of gender roles in medieval Europe? Did the necessity of female labor during these years plant seeds of change in how communities valued women's work? Or did society quickly revert to its old hierarchies, erasing the memory of how women had kept families alive when fields failed? The rains eventually ended. By late 1317, the skies cleared, and though the soil remained soggy and fields had been neglected, a harvest finally offered some relief. Grain returned to markets. Bread, though still costly, no longer required bark or acorns to bulk it out. Families that had endured the past 2 years tasted wheat again. Yet famine leaves scars that linger long after the stomach is filled. For women, those scars lived in memory, memories of decisions no one should have to make, memories of desperate bargains and bitter meals, memories of children they could not save. While kings and chroniclers moved on to record the next war, the next coronation, the next crusade, peasant women carried famine in their bones and in their quiet practices long afterward. Even when food returned, women did not abandon the habits famine had taught them. Households continued to collect nettles and herbs, not from necessity but as a precaution. Bark bread might vanish from daily life, but memories of it endured in folk stories and warnings. Children who had survived were told of those years, and mothers impressed upon them the importance of thrift, of storing grain carefully, of never wasting food. Women also remembered the fragility of markets. They knew now that grain could vanish overnight, that traders might hoard or raise prices when famine struck. So, where possible, they sought to keep small stores hidden, even if only a few handfuls of peas or beans tucked away. This secret knowledge of risk became part of women's quiet governance of the household, yet, despite this legacy, famine was not remembered as women's history. Chroniclers framed it as an act of God, a punishment for sin, or as a natural calamity. They listed the failures of crops and the prices of grain but rarely the names of women who ground acorns into powder or boiled nettles into soup. The work of survival was invisible precisely because it was ordinary, domestic, and unheroic even when women were mentioned. It was often through the lens of morality. A widow trading her body for bread became a cautionary tale about sin. A mother accused of hoarding grain became a symbol of selfishness. Rarely did records frame these actions as acts of desperation born of responsibility for others. The moral weight of famine was unfairly distributed, often falling hardest on the women who had carried its physical weight. This silence shaped how famine was remembered. Generations later, ballads and folk tales spoke of hunger, but they often personified famine as an abstract figure, the hungry years, or the wolf at the door, rather than recording the names and faces of those who endured it. Women's ingenuity, their networks of barter, their knowledge of herbs, all of it sank into the background noise of history, and yet, if we look closely, faint traces remain. In some regions, recipes for famine bread survived in oral tradition, handed down as warnings of what might come again. In Norway, for example, accounts describe bread made of ground bark well into the early modern period, remembered specifically as a practice during hunger years. In Germany, folk sayings warn that, when bark bread returns, God has turned away. In these cultural fragments, we glimpse echoes of women's labor. After all, it was not monks or knights who invented bark bread, it was women at hearthstones, testing what could be digested, passing that knowledge to daughters. Though their names are lost, their inventions survived in the memory of communities. Likewise, in scattered manorial records, we find evidence of female-headed households in the aftermath of famine. Widows who survived were listed as tenants, paying rents for land once managed by husbands. These records are dry, but between their lines we see women who carried families through famine and then rebuilt in its wake. Their survival was not grand, but it was stubborn, and it shaped the demographic recovery of Europe. One of the ironies of famine is that it often taught lessons societies tried to forget. The Great Famine revealed just how dependent communities were on fragile systems of agriculture, trade, and weather. For women, it revealed the limits of what could be controlled within the household and the vast burdens placed upon them when everything else failed. Some of these lessons lingered quietly. Women remained central in managing subsistence, not just in famine years but in ordinary times. Their foraging, gardening, and kitchen work became insurance against future scarcity. They carried with them a cautious outlook, a knowledge that security could vanish quickly, that survival depended not only on fields but on flexibility, barter, and ingenuity. Yet, larger society did not absorb these lessons. Kings and nobles quickly returned to wars, levying taxes and conscripting men even as villages still reeled from loss. Clergy resumed debates about sin and doctrine, rarely mentioning the simple acts of grinding bark or boiling weeds. Women remembered, but institutions forgot that we must also ask, how did famine shape children who survived it? A boy who grew up chewing on bark bread, a girl who remembered her mother weeping quietly over a pot of nettle soup, what did they carry into adulthood? Many of these children grew into adults marked by caution, frugality, and mistrust of abundance. Mothers passed their lessons on, urging thrift and warning against waste. And yet, famine's emotional wounds may also have scarred families. Parents who lost children carried grief silently, shaping their relationships with those who remained. In this way, famine lived on not only in the fields and markets but in the intimate psychology of families, carried forward long after the rains ended. If famine taught anything, it was that survival was not a matter of heroic action but of countless small decisions, many made by women. They were not remembered because their work was repetitive, humble, and domestic. But in truth, the endurance of medieval Europe through the Great Famine rested on these unheralded strategies. We often think of history in terms of battles, kings, and events that shift borders. But survival in famine years was a battle of households against hunger. And the generals of that battle were not kings, they were women, anonymous yet determined, whose hands ground bark, stirred soups, and bartered onions. So, as we close this first story, imagine again the woman at her hearth in 1316. Rain lashes the roof. Her husband has gone in search of day labor and may not return. Her children cry with hunger. On the table lies a small pile of acorns she has gathered, and she begins the weary work of grinding them into flour. It is not nourishing. It will not erase hunger. But it will keep life flickering for one more day. History did not record her name. But without women like her, countless families would not have survived those years. The Great Famine is remembered as a European tragedy, yet its survival was written in kitchens, hedgerows, and silent bargains, written, in other words, by women. And this leaves us with a question that echoes into the present: if so much of survival in history depended on invisible female labor, how much of our understanding of the past remains incomplete, shaped only by the voices that recorded wars and kings, while forgetting the quiet endurance that truly kept families alive? When you picture France in the Middle Ages, perhaps you think of soaring cathedrals, of Paris with its bustling markets, or of the vineyards that still define the countryside today. But in the early 14th century, the same years that brought the Great Famine to northern Europe, many French villages were far from abundance. For ordinary peasants, life was already precarious in normal years. A single poor harvest meant hunger. 2 in a row meant despair. And in those fragile households, women once again bore the responsibility of keeping families alive when the thin line of subsistence snapped. In rural France, peasant families lived close to the land. Most worked small strips of soil owned by a lord, paying rent or service in exchange. Grain, especially rye and barley, was the foundation of diet. Bread was not just food, it was identity. To eat bread was to live like a human being, to be without it was to teeter on the edge of desperation. But bread required flour, and flour required harvests that famine rains destroyed. When harvests failed, women became the central managers of survival. A husband might labor in the fields or attempt to hire himself to another landowner, but the burden of feeding children, elderly parents, and even neighbors fell largely on women. They stood at the center of domestic life, deciding how much flour to grind, how to stretch it, what to substitute when none remained. Let us step into a cottage in Normandy around 1316. The floor is beaten earth. Smoke curls from a small hearth where a pot hangs on an iron hook. On the shelf sits a wooden bowl, a jug of water, and a handful of beans, precious beans, perhaps the last in the house. The mother of this household knows they cannot all be eaten today. She measures them carefully, counting how many to drop into the pot, how much water to add, how long to boil them until they break into a thin broth. Her children crowd near, watching eagerly. Hunger makes them restless, impatient. She soothes them with promises: tomorrow, there will be more. She does not say what she already knows, that tomorrow's pot will have fewer beans and more water. The hearth has become a battlefield of decisions, every ladle a compromise between immediate relief and tomorrow's hunger. In towns, mothers faced the same dilemmas but with slightly different tools. They might buy scraps from butchers, bones stripped of most meat, boiled again and again to release flavor. A thin broth with bread crusts floating in it became a staple, so common that chroniclers described famine years as the time when all pots were thin. Beyond the hearth, women turned to the countryside itself. Foraging was not new. Even in good years, peasants collected wild herbs, mushrooms, and berries to supplement diets. But famine expanded this practice into desperate searches. Women gathered sorrel, nettles, lamb's quarters, and chickweed, boiling them into what was called potage maigre, lean pottage. The flavor was sour, the nutrition minimal, but it filled bowls. Roots were dug from riverbanks, burdock, dandelion, and wild carrots. Some women risked gathering fungi, though the dangers of poisoning were real. A wrong choice could kill a family already weakened by hunger. Knowledge of which plants were safe became a form of power. Mothers passed this knowledge quietly to daughters, ensuring that the skills of famine survival traveled across generations. In some places, women stripped tree bark for flour, much as in northern Europe. Accounts from the Loire Valley mention pain de famine, famine bread, made of chestnut flour stretched with acorns. Chestnuts were especially important in southern France, where they had long been part of local diets. In bad years, chestnut groves became lifelines, and women carried baskets into the hills to gather fallen nuts, drying and grinding them into meal. As in other regions, famine warped the economy. Coin lost value when food was scarce, barter rose in importance. French. Mothers often traded what they had in small amounts. A length of spun thread might purchase a bowl of grain. A day of washing clothes for a wealthier household might earn scraps of cheese. Women created microeconomies, not written down in ledgers but remembered in kitchens and doorways. These exchanges were often gendered. Men traded labor for coin or food, but women traded domestic skills, milk from a goat, or even childcare. In doing so, they extended survival beyond their own families. One mother might take in another's infant while she searched for food, creating bonds of obligation that stretched across famine years. Religion shaped famine survival in France as deeply as in any part of Europe. Women led children in prayers, hoping for divine intervention. Churches declared fasts, but for many peasants, fasting was indistinguishable from famine itself. Women adapted rituals to survival, saving a scrap of bread for Sundays to ensure at least symbolic participation in communion. Charity from monasteries and churches offered some relief, though limited. Women gathered at convent gates, waiting for alms. Some chroniclers describe lines of mothers clutching infants, hoping for ladles of pottage from religious kitchens. The image of women begging reinforced clerical teachings about humility, but it also reveals who bore famine's visible face. Men might be absent, seeking work or already dead from exhaustion, but women appeared in every queue, every distribution of aid, their children clinging to their skirts. Famine also made women vulnerable to suspicion. In French towns, rumors sometimes spread that certain women had hoarded grain or sold it secretly to profiteers. Accusations of witchcraft were less common in the early 14th century than they would become later, but women's unusual knowledge of herbs or ability to find food in unexpected places occasionally drew envy or hostility. A mother who could feed her children when others starved risked becoming the object of resentment. Yet most stories suggest admiration rather than blame. Chronicles mention clever wives who found ways to keep families alive. Folklore later celebrated such figures as wise women, though their real lives were surely harsher than legend suggests. The emotional burden was immense. Mothers faced their children's hunger daily, an agony far deeper than their own. To listen to a child cry at night, begging for bread, was to endure a kind of torture. Women often cut their own portions to feed children, wasting away while trying to preserve younger lives. Records from Burgundy describe women fainting from weakness in fields or collapsing at market stalls. Yet, even in despair, humor sometimes appeared. Folk songs from famine years mocked the thinness of soup or the toughness of famine bread. Laughter, however bitter, became a form of resistance, a way to endure the unendurable. It was women, often, who sang such songs while stirring pots, softening hunger with humor. The thin soup of survival became part of collective memory in France. Families told stories of the bad years, remembering the ingenuity of mothers who boiled weeds into stew or stretched one onion across 3 meals. These stories did not make it into chronicles, but they lingered in households, shaping attitudes toward food and thrift. Children who grew up in famine carried into adulthood a reverence for bread, a suspicion of waste, and a fear of hunger's return. And so, when you picture famine in medieval France, do not think only of empty markets or rotting fields. Think of the woman at her hearth, stirring a pot with too much water and too few beans, watching her children's eyes as they wait. Her kitchen is not the setting of dramatic history, yet it is here that survival was negotiated, day by day, with every ladle of soup. But as you imagine that pot simmering, one question remains: were these strategies of survival enough to protect families long-term, or did they merely delay the inevitable toll of hunger and disease that stalked every famine year? In the previous section, you glimpsed the daily toil of washerwomen, the relentless rhythm of scrubbing, rinsing, wringing, and carrying. You saw how their labor propped up entire households while leaving them socially invisible. But washerwomen were not entirely powerless. In the 18th century, as France moved toward the great upheavals of revolution, these women began to assert themselves, sometimes in small acts of defiance, sometimes in ways that shook the civic order. This was not rebellion in the dramatic sense of storming barricades or toppling kings. Instead, it was the quiet rebellion of women who refused to remain silent about the indignities they faced, who demanded fairer wages, who fought against regulations that bound them, and who claimed public space in a society that preferred they remain unseen. Unlike bakers, butchers, or tailors, washerwomen did not belong to strong, established guilds that could regulate work and protect members. Laundry was considered too menial to merit formal oversight, and the women who performed it too poor and transient to organize effectively. This lack of structure made washerwomen vulnerable. Employers, wealthy households, inns, or hospitals, set wages as they pleased. Payment might be delayed for weeks or withheld entirely. If a shirt was lost or damaged, washerwomen often had the cost docked from their already meager pay. And because the work was seasonal, with far more demand in summer than winter, women faced periods of near starvation. In some cities, municipal councils attempted to impose regulation. They issued licenses requiring washerwomen to register, pay fees, and adhere to designated working spaces such as public lavoirs. Officials claimed this maintained cleanliness and order, but for washerwomen it meant another burden, money they could scarcely afford to part with, rules that limited their independence. Washerwomen, however, did not simply accept these conditions. Archival records reveal petitions written on their behalf, sometimes signed by dozens of women, sometimes by sympathetic intermediaries. In 1769, for example, washerwomen in Lyon protested a new tax on the use of public washhouses, arguing that it consumed nearly all their profits. The language of these petitions is striking. The women described themselves not as rebels but as humble laborers essential to society. They pointed out that soldiers, merchants, and even priests relied on them for cleanliness. They argued that to tax or harass washerwomen was to attack the very foundation of public health and decency. Though such petitions rarely overturned regulations entirely, they sometimes won concessions, reduced fees, longer opening hours at washhouses, or protection from harassment by guards. More importantly, they marked washerwomen as participants in civic discourse, women who demanded recognition of their labor's value. Outside official petitions, washerwomen also engaged in more direct, communal forms of protest. One of the most vivid was their role in chivalrous, noisy, mocking demonstrations traditionally aimed at individuals who violated community norms. In Paris and provincial towns alike, washerwomen sometimes led these events, banging pots and shouting in protest against landlords who overcharged them, or against officials who imposed unfair restrictions. Their public visibility and ability to mobilize large groups gave them an unusual, if precarious, form of influence. Authorities often regarded them as disorderly women, loud, vulgar, resistant to authority. But in their noise lay power. The collective voice of washerwomen, amplified in the streets, was difficult to ignore. Some washerwomen were not self-employed but worked for hospitals, convents, or the military. These institutions required enormous quantities of laundry, sheets for patients, uniforms for soldiers, habits for nuns. In hospitals, laundry work was both essential and perilous. Washerwomen handled sheets stained with blood, pus, and other evidence of illness. They boiled these linens when they could, but infection spread easily. Many women became ill themselves. Yet hospitals paid little, reasoning that washerwomen could be easily replaced. Military laundresses, known as vivandières or blanchiseuses d'armes, traveled with regiments, scrubbing soldiers' uniforms in rivers beside encampments. Their presence blurred the line between civilian and military life. Some married soldiers, others lived independently, but all endured the same long marches, the same shortages of food, the same exposure to the elements. While generals discussed tactics, washerwomen fought their own daily battles, against mud, disease, and neglect. By the mid-1700s, France was a nation buzzing with ideas of liberty, equality, and natural rights. Philosophers like Rousseau and Diderot wrote treatises on education, social contracts, and human dignity. But washerwomen rarely appeared in their visions of a better society. At best, Enlightenment thinkers invoked washerwomen as symbols of simplicity, honest, working women uncorrupted by courtly luxury. At worst, they mocked them as crude, their chatter used as examples of unrefined speech. The contradiction is stark. While thinkers spoke of universal humanity, they ignored the very real humanity of women kneeling in rivers and lavoirs. And yet, washerwomen were listening. Literacy rates among poor women were low, but not non-existent. Gossip in lavoirs carried news of reforms, rumors of political upheaval, and debates about rights. In their own way, washerwomen absorbed the language of justice and dignity, even if filtered through stories and conversations rather than books. One curious sign of recognition, however fleeting, was the Mi-Carême festival in Paris. Held halfway through Lent, this celebration included a queen of washerwomen chosen to preside over processions. Washerwomen dressed in their best clothes, paraded through the streets, and enjoyed a rare day of festivity in their honor. But the honor was ambiguous. To some, it acknowledged their importance. To others, it mocked them, turning their poverty into spectacle, their brief queenship into a parody of true power. For washerwomen themselves, the festival was both pride and parody, a chance to step briefly into visibility, only to return the next day to basins of cold water and endless cloth. As the 18th century drew toward its dramatic close, washerwomen increasingly became entangled in broader social unrest. High bread prices, new taxes, and the collapse of royal authority pushed ordinary people into the streets. Washerwomen, with their networks in lavoirs and their public presence along riversides, were particularly well placed to spread news and grievances. When the revolution began in 1789, washerwomen were among the many working women who joined marches, shouted slogans, and demanded justice. They may not have written manifestos, but their voices filled the streets nonetheless. For them, the revolution was not just about abstract rights, it was about bread on the table, lower rents, and fairer treatment for their labor. Washerwomen of 18th-century France lived lives of hardship, yet they were far from passive. Through petitions, protests, and sheer collective noise, they asserted themselves against a society that sought to ignore them. And as France edged toward revolution, these women carried with them a deep knowledge of injustice, one rooted not in books but in the daily pain of work. It makes us wonder, when the Great Revolution finally erupted, what role did washerwomen's voices, shouting across riversides and echoing through lavoirs, play in shaping the tide of history? The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, is often remembered through images of guillotines, stormed prisons, and fiery speeches in crowded assemblies. Names like Robespierre, Danton, and Marat dominate the stage. But beneath the noise of politics, washerwomen continued to kneel in rivers, boil water in tubs, and beat cloth against stones. For them, revolution meant both change and continuity, moments of empowerment intertwined with enduring poverty. Washerwomen had always lived on the edge of visibility, mocked in songs, caricatured in plays, honored fleetingly at festivals, but seldom granted true recognition. The revolution would briefly push them further into the spotlight. And yet, as the century turned, they found themselves once more returned to obscurity, their labor as essential, and as undervalued, as ever. When Paris erupted in July 1789, washerwomen were among the crowds. They knew the streets intimately, carrying laundry to and from households, chatting in markets, gathering news in lavoirs. Their work tied them into networks of rumor and information, the lifeblood of revolutionary mobilization. Eyewitness accounts mention washerwomen among those who marched on Versailles in October 1789. These were not women of salons or aristocratic drawing rooms, but women of hard labor, their bodies toughened by years of hauling wet cloth. They joined others demanding bread, shouting for justice, confronting soldiers with the same fearlessness they had shown in icy rivers and on slippery banks. Their voices may not appear in the speeches of the National Assembly, but they echoed in the streets, insistent, practical, impossible to ignore. The revolution promised liberty, equality, fraternity. For washerwomen, these slogans offered hope of better wages, lower taxes, and more respect for their trade. But reality was uneven. Some municipalities abolished fees for lavoirs or loosened regulations, recognizing washerwomen as citizens entitled to work freely. For a brief moment, they experienced a kind of dignity denied to them under the old regime. Women spoke in public meetings, demanded fairer prices for bread, and celebrated the idea that their labor, too, had value in the new France. Yet the revolution also brought turmoil. Wars consumed resources, leaving fewer supplies for soap and firewood. Inflation devoured wages. Washerwomen's already precarious incomes shrank further. And the violence of political conflict, executions, purges, and civil war, meant instability that made survival even more uncertain. The revolution gave washerwomen a voice, but not the lasting improvement in conditions they so desperately needed. During the early years of the revolution, Paris saw the rise of women's political clubs, where working women gathered to discuss rights, justice, and reform. Some washerwomen attended, drawn by the chance to speak collectively about the burdens they endured. But their voices were often drowned out by more educated or wealthier women who dominated debates. When washerwomen spoke of wages, rents, or the crushing physicality of their labor, their concerns could seem parochial compared to lofty ideals of political equality. By 1793, when the radical Jacobins shut down women's clubs entirely, washerwomen once again found themselves excluded. The revolution had briefly cracked open a door to political life, only to slam it shut again. Even as their direct political power remained limited, washerwomen lingered in revolutionary culture. Satirical prints depicted them waving laundry bats as weapons, their arms raised in mock fury. Songs praised their toughness, likening them to soldiers of the domestic front. In these images, washerwomen became symbols of the working-class women of Paris, rough, noisy, fearless. They embodied both admiration and ridicule, celebrated for their energy while derided for their supposed coarseness. Their very bodies, hardened by toil, seemed to reflect the revolution's raw, unpolished strength. But behind the symbolism lay real women, with aching backs, cracked hands, and empty stomachs. The revolutionary imagination turned them into caricatures, just as the old regime had, when Napoleon rose to power in 1799. France entered yet another political era. For washerwomen, little changed. The empire required immense quantities of laundry for its armies, and washerwomen followed troops just as they had under the monarchy. Civilian washerwomen returned to riversides and lavoirs, their lives largely untouched by the grand political restructuring of the nation. Napoleon introduced reforms to guilds and labor regulations, but washerwomen remained outside formal protections. They were still paid poorly, still exposed to disease, still dismissed as vulgar or insignificant. The revolution had promised equality, but for washerwomen, equality meant being equally forgotten. Once the shouting faded. Into the 19th century, washerwomen continued their endless cycles of toil. Writers like Balzac and Zola would later depict them, often sympathetically, as symbols of urban poverty. The Industrial Revolution introduced new machines and laundries, but for decades the majority of laundry was still done by women on their knees at riversides, their arms red and raw from cold water. By then, washerwomen had become part of the urban landscape, a fixture as recognizable as market women or street vendors. And yet their social position remained unchanged, marginalized, mocked, necessary but undervalued. Looking back, washerwomen of 18th century France leave behind a paradoxical legacy. On one hand, they were invisible, absent from official histories, ignored by philosophers, excluded from political power. On the other, they were indispensable. Every household, from palaces to taverns, relied on their labor. They sustained public health, dignity, and comfort, even while being denied recognition for it. Their endurance also hints at something larger. In their petitions, protests, and noisy solidarity in lavoirs, washerwomen planted seeds of resistance. They demonstrated that even the most marginalized workers could demand fairness, however small their victories. Their struggles foreshadowed later movements for labor rights and women's equality. Today, their names are lost. No monuments commemorate them, no statues stand in their honor. And yet, their fingerprints remain, on the crisp linen of history itself, on the idea that even the dullest, most exhausting labor carries dignity, value, and meaning. Washerwomen never held power in assemblies, never shaped philosophy, never commanded armies. But in their silence, in their ceaseless toil, they remind us of the countless invisible hands that built and sustained the world. Their story asks a question that lingers: how many other lives of hidden labor, dismissed as unimportant, have quietly shaped history without ever being remembered? When you think of the grandeur of Rome, images come to mind of marble temples, triumphal arches, legions marching in disciplined ranks, and senators debating beneath painted ceilings. But the real foundation of Rome's power was not its monuments or even its armies. It was grain, simple, unremarkable grain, stored in vast granaries that stretched across the empire. Without grain, Rome would have starved. Without granaries, its armies would have faltered. Rome ruled by the stomach as much as by the sword. Feeding millions of citizens and soldiers required a system so vast and intricate that it rivaled the aqueducts and roads in its importance. Yet the story of Roman granaries is not one of glory but of dust, pests, and labor. It is a story of men hauling sacks of wheat in the heat of North Africa, of dock workers unloading ships on the Tiber, of clerks scratching tallies into wax tablets, and of long warehouses where silence was broken only by the rustle of rats in the shadows. This was the uncelebrated machinery of empire. And like the washerwomen of France or the famine-stricken mothers of medieval villages, these workers sustained history in ways rarely remembered. At its height, the city of Rome held more than 1 million inhabitants, the largest urban population the ancient world had ever seen. Keeping such a city fed was a staggering challenge. Bread formed the core of the Roman diet. Every day, tens of thousands of bushels of grain had to be milled, baked, and distributed. Much of this grain came not from Italy itself, but from distant provinces. Egypt, conquered in 30 BCE, became Rome's breadbasket. North Africa, modern Tunisia and Algeria, supplied enormous harvests. Sicily and Sardinia also contributed. Grain traveled by ship across the Mediterranean, up the Tiber River, and into Rome's storehouses. But before it could be transformed into loaves of bread, grain had to be stored safely. Spoiled grain could mean hunger, riots, or worse, military defeat. Granaries, Horia in Latin, became as crucial to Rome's survival as its legions. Roman granaries were feats of practical engineering. Unlike the grand columns of temples, they impressed through function. They were long, rectangular buildings, their thick stone or brick walls designed to keep out heat and moisture. The floors were raised above ground on stone piers, allowing air to circulate beneath and discouraging rodents. Some were lined with waterproof cement to protect grain from damp. In military camps along the frontiers, granaries were carefully built near gates, making it easier to move supplies in and out. Archaeologists have uncovered such structures in Britain, Germany, and along the Danube. In the heart of Rome, the Horia Galbae complex, covering more than 225,000 square meters, stood as one of the largest storage facilities of the ancient world. Inside, grain was stored in sacks or heaped in bins. Workers with bare feet shuffled through the piles to shift and aerate the grain, preventing rot. Dust filled the air, coating hair, skin, and lungs. A granary was not a place of spectacle but of monotony, labor, and constant vigilance. The men responsible for maintaining these stores were known as horarii. Their tasks were simple but unrelenting: receiving deliveries, weighing grain, recording tallies, turning piles to prevent spoilage, repairing walls and roofs, and fending off infestations of rats or insects. They lived lives of dust and ledgers, their importance recognized only when something went wrong. If grain spoiled, if shipments failed to arrive, or if records were inaccurate, punishment could be severe. Rome did not tolerate famine lightly. Grain shortages led directly to riots, with angry citizens storming bakeries or attacking officials. For the horarii, a careless mistake could mean more than dismissal, it could mean execution. And yet, for all the danger, their names are almost entirely lost. History preserved the deeds of generals, not the tally marks. Of grain clerks in Rome, bread was more than food. It was politics. The annona, the state grain dole, provided subsidized or free grain to hundreds of thousands of citizens. Emperors understood that keeping the people fed was essential to keeping them loyal. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal put it, were the twin tools of control. Granaries thus became instruments of statecraft. Their stores represented not just calories but stability. A full granary meant peace. An empty one meant rebellion. When ships were delayed by storms or when North African harvests failed, panic spread quickly. Crowds gathered at granaries demanding food. Soldiers were dispatched to guard shipments. The health of the empire could be measured in the fullness of its bins. Behind every loaf of Roman bread lay an invisible chain of labor. Farmers plowed fields under the North African sun. Harvesters cut wheat with sickles, bundled it, and threshed it on stone floors. Dockworkers loaded sacks onto ships, rowers and sailors transported it across seas, porters hauled it into warehouses, and bakers finally transformed it into bread. The granaries sat at the center of this web, silent witnesses to the passage of countless hands. Each worker's contribution was small, but together they sustained the largest empire the world had yet seen. Despite their size, Roman granaries were not invulnerable. Fires, whether accidental or deliberate, destroyed stores with frightening regularity. Grain, once ignited, burned with ferocious intensity, sending choking smoke into the sky. Floods damaged riverside warehouses. Insects burrowed into kernels. Rats gnawed through sacks, their droppings contaminating stores. Granary guards fought a constant battle against these enemies. Cats prowled warehouses, snapping up rodents. Traps were set. Workers sifted through piles of grain with bare hands, searching for weevils. But no system was perfect. Losses were inevitable. The question was always, could enough be saved to prevent hunger? Consider this, a Roman legion of 5,000 men required around 60,000 pounds of grain per month. Multiply that by dozens of legions stationed across the empire, plus the civilian population of Rome itself, and the scale becomes staggering. Grain was not just food, it was strategy, survival, empire itself. Without granaries, Rome's carefully balanced system would have collapsed. They were not glamorous, but they were the lifeline of civilization. So much of Roman greatness rested not on marble or bronze but on grain piled in shadowy warehouses, guarded by forgotten men. It leaves us with a curious question: in an empire that built monuments to emperors, why did it build none to the humble granary, without which no emperor could have ruled at all? When you imagine the bustling heart of Rome, perhaps you think of the Forum, packed with senators, merchants, and philosophers. But to the ordinary Roman, the most important place was not a marble basilica or temple, it was the grain queue. For hundreds of thousands of citizens, daily survival meant waiting for their portion of the annona, the grain ration guaranteed by the state. This was not charity. It was policy, carefully maintained because emperors understood that hunger could topple thrones more quickly than barbarians at the gates. The origins of Rome's grain dole go back to the late Republic. In 123 BCE, the reformer Gaius Gracchus introduced a law allowing Roman citizens to purchase grain from the state at a subsidized price. His brother, Tiberius, had already championed land reforms, but Gaius grasped that in a city swollen with poor, urban citizens, land alone would not solve unrest. Food security had to be guaranteed. Over time, this modest subsidy grew into the annona, a massive program that by the time of Augustus fed as many as 200,000 Roman citizens each month. For those on the dole, survival depended not on wages or farming but on the state's ability to procure, transport, and store grain. It was welfare in its most basic form, bread as the currency of loyalty. Feeding Rome required a logistical network of astonishing scale. Each year, massive fleets of grain ships, navis honorarii, sailed from Alexandria in Egypt, Carthage in North Africa, and ports in Sicily and Sardinia. These vessels, some capable of carrying up to 400 tons of grain, crossed the Mediterranean in convoys timed to the rhythms of the harvest. The grain was then unloaded at Ostia, Rome's port at the mouth of the Tiber, or later at the grander port of Portus, built by Claudius and expanded by Trajan. From there, barges carried it upriver to the city's Horia. Once inside these granaries, clerks meticulously tracked each sack. From the Horia, grain was milled into flour or distributed directly to citizens, who would grind it at home. The sheer scale is difficult to fathom. Estimates suggest that Rome required around 150,000 tons of grain annually. Any disruption in this supply, storms at sea, piracy, poor harvests, could plunge the city into crisis. Because food was power, control of grain supply became a political weapon. Ambitious politicians promised to expand or cheapen the dole to win popular support. Julius Caesar, during his rise to power, reduced the number of recipients to cut costs, then increased it again when he needed favor. Augustus, in his careful balancing of empire, institutionalized the praefectus annoni, a special office dedicated to managing Rome's food supply. This position carried immense responsibility. To fail was to invite riots and imperial wrath alike. Emperors used grain to secure loyalty. Distributing grain on time became a ritual of legitimacy. When shortages struck, crowds turned hostile. Grain riots could erupt with terrifying speed. In 51 BCE, when a shortage left markets empty, mobs surrounded the Senate, demanding relief. Cicero himself, as governor of Sicily, faced accusations of hoarding grain for personal gain, a scandal that nearly ruined him. For the ordinary Roman, bread was not merely sustenance, it was identity. Loaves came in many forms: round flatbreads, dense barley loaves, or the lighter wheat bread reserved for wealthier tables. Public bakeries lined the streets, their ovens glowing late into the night. Families would collect flour from their ration and bring it to a local baker to be turned into bread. But dependence on state grain shaped habits. Citizens grew accustomed to lining up, sometimes for hours, waiting for distribution. Wax tablets with names were checked against registers. Each person's share was measured and handed over in a sack. Children often accompanied their parents, clutching the heavy bundles home. The experience was repetitive, uneventful, and absolutely central to life. In a way, the granary's silence extended into the daily routines of Roman citizens: endless waiting, endless carrying, endless grinding. Yet without this dull ritual, the city could not exist. Where grain moved, corruption followed. Officials skimmed from shipments, bakers adulterated flour with dust or chaff, dockworkers siphoned off sacks for black market resale. Even emperors faced accusations of misuse. The horia, supposedly symbols of state reliability, were not immune to theft. Guards sometimes looked the other way, clerks falsified records. For the poor, these abuses mattered. A smaller ration meant hunger. A delay in delivery meant riots. The dull monotony of grain keeping was punctured at times by explosions of violence, reminding everyone, from the humblest clerk to the emperor himself, that the empire stood on fragile foundations. As Rome grew, its dependence on distant provinces deepened. Egypt, with its fertile Nile delta, became indispensable. The Nile's annual flood ensured reliable harvests, and Roman administrators oversaw shipments to feed the capital. North Africa soon joined Egypt as a breadbasket, its vast estates worked by enslaved labor producing wheat for export rather than local consumption. This created an empire both powerful and precarious. A storm in the Mediterranean, a rebellion in Egypt, or a bad harvest in Africa could send shockwaves into the streets of Rome. The granaries might be full one season and dangerously empty the next. The genius of Rome lay not only in conquest but in administration. Yet even the best administrators could not control nature. Drought, locusts, or blight could undo years of careful planning. In times of shortage, the state scrambled, sending soldiers to guard shipments, commanding private merchants to sell at fixed prices, or even distributing emergency rations of inferior grains like barley. Citizens, meanwhile, lived with the anxiety of dependence. Each trip to the granary carried an unspoken question: would the ration be there, or would hunger stalk the household tonight? In this system of bread and politics, one sees the empire's paradox. Rome was mighty enough to conquer the Mediterranean, yet fragile enough that a single failed harvest in Egypt could set its greatest city aflame with riots. And so we are left to wonder, did the strength of Rome lie in its armies and monuments, or was it always most vulnerable at the quiet threshold of the granary doors, where anxious citizens waited with empty sacks? By now, you can picture the great warehouses of Rome, their stone walls, their raised floors, their endless piles of grain. You have seen the queues of citizens waiting with wax tablets and sacks, and the scribes hunched over ledgers by lamplight. You have heard the quiet rustle of rats and the soft shuffle of bare feet turning wheat to prevent spoilage. The granary was a symbol of Rome's strength, but also its fragility. In this final part of the story, we turn to what happened when this delicate system began to falter, how an empire that had once controlled the bread of the Mediterranean came to struggle, and what traces of Rome's grain system lingered long after its fall. The empire's grain network, so vast and efficient in its prime, was also inflexible. It relied on predictable harvests, secure seas, and smooth administration. Any disruption reverberated quickly. By the 3rd century CE, Rome faced mounting challenges. Political instability meant constant turnover of emperors. Civil wars interrupted transport and led to requisitioning of grain for armies rather than civilians. Pirate raids in the Mediterranean increased, threatening shipments. Inflation and debasement of currency strained state finances, making subsidies harder to sustain. Rome's hunger was unrelenting. A city of hundreds of thousands could not shrink its appetite, even as the empire's resources were stretched thinner. The granaries, once brimming with security, now carried the echo of unease. The annona was both Rome's strength and its weakness. It kept the urban poor loyal, but it tied the empire to a costly, fragile system. By the late empire, emperors increasingly distributed bread itself rather than raw grain, in part to exert more control over quality and price. This meant expanding public bakeries, but it also created new opportunities for corruption and mismanagement. As the empire's borders contracted and provinces were lost, the dependable flow of grain narrowed. When Rome lost control of Egypt in the 7th century, centuries after the Western Empire had already collapsed, the Mediterranean world was forever changed. The breadbasket that had once fed Rome now slipped beyond its reach. Even as the central system struggled, the military still relied heavily on granaries at forts and frontier towns. Archaeological remains from Britain and Germany reveal rows of stone storehouses, sometimes larger than the barracks themselves. Soldiers' rations, grain ground into coarse porridge or baked into hard bread, depended on these supplies. But frontier granaries faced constant risk. Raids, sieges, or simple neglect could starve an army in weeks. Historians believe that in many campaigns, Roman defeats were not caused by superior enemies but by empty supply stores. In this way, the humble granary decided the fate of battles more than the gleam of armor. For ordinary citizens, the decline of Rome's grain system meant more than politics. It meant waiting in line only to receive smaller portions. It meant bread mixed with chaff or spoiled flour. It meant riots in marketplaces, bakeries shuttered, and rumors spreading through the streets, that a shipment had sunk, that Egypt had failed to harvest, that the emperor had diverted grain to the legions instead of the people. Mothers fed children thinner porridge. Bakers stretched loaves. Hunger, once kept at bay by the great warehouses, returned in waves. The granaries still stood, but their silence was no longer reassuring. It was ominous. The decline of Roman granaries was not dramatic but gradual, a series of small erosions. Fires destroyed stockpiles, corruption ate at the system's core, climate shifts reduced harvests. Each disaster chipped away at the reliability of supply. By the 5th century CE, when barbarian invasions struck the Western Empire, Rome no longer had the resilience it once possessed. Starving citizens could not defend an empty city. Armies could not march on empty stomachs. The empire, so mighty in appearance, was hollowed from within. Bread, once its great strength, had become its greatest vulnerability, yet Rome's system did not vanish without leaving a legacy. Medieval rulers inherited the lesson that food supply was political power. Kings built granaries in castles and monasteries, ensuring reserves for famine years. Cities across Europe developed grain stores as a form of civic insurance. The idea that rulers owed their people not just protection but sustenance came directly from Rome. Even today, the principle lingers. Modern governments maintain strategic reserves of grain. Nations track harvests with anxiety, knowing that hunger can destabilize societies faster than armies. The silent warehouses of Rome whisper across centuries, reminding us that political order rests on something as simple as bread. If you were to stand in the ruins of the Horia Galbae in Rome today, you would see little more than crumbling walls and weed-strewn foundations. Tourists pass by, scarcely noticing. Yet once, those walls guarded the lifeblood of an empire. They held not treasure, but wheat. Not gold, but flour. And it was enough to hold 1 million people in uneasy peace. The true power of Rome was not its marble, nor its armies, nor its emperors. It was the granary, the dull, dusty, overlooked warehouse where the empire's survival was counted out in bushels and tallied in wax. Rome's story ends not with a bang but with an empty stomach. The empire that conquered the world fell, in part, because it could not keep its own citizens fed. The granary, once its greatest strength, revealed the fragility of civilizations, that power rests not on monuments or armies, but on whether there is bread on the table tomorrow. And so, as you drift into rest, you might ask yourself one final question: if Rome could fall to hunger, what of our own world, still bound, grain by grain, to the silent warehouses that sustain us? When you picture a medieval monastery, perhaps you imagine quiet cloisters, robed figures moving slowly with bowed heads, or the gentle sound of chanting echoing through stone halls. Monasteries were indeed places of prayer, learning, and discipline. But they were also places of survival, communities of men and women who lived within walls, bound by rules, and utterly dependent on their ability to feed themselves. In times of famine, the monastery became a paradox. On the one hand, it was a sanctuary, with its gardens, storehouses, and carefully managed estates. On the other hand, monks and nuns were not immune to hunger. They too had to stretch their supplies, endure the monotony of limited diets, and find meaning in meals that grew smaller and plainer with each passing week of scarcity. This story is not about abbots or bishops, nor about illuminated manuscripts or theological debates. It is about porridge ladled from iron cauldrons, about dried peas and sour bread, about the dull ache of hunger within stone walls. It is about the forgotten diets of monks during famine years, and how faith, discipline, and practicality kept them alive. The daily lives of monks and nuns were governed by strict regulations, most famously the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century. This rule dictated when to pray, when to work, when to sleep, and also, what to eat. According to Benedict's guidelines, meals were to be modest, usually 2 per day, with no meat from 4-footed animals for most monks. Fish, eggs, dairy, legumes, vegetables, and bread formed the backbone of the diet. Wine was permitted in moderation. Fasting was common, not only during Lent but on many holy days throughout the year. This meant that even in times of plenty, the monastic diet was already spare compared to that of peasants or lords. A monk did not sit down to feasts of venison or capons. Instead, he might eat beans stewed with onions, coarse barley bread, or salted fish. The idea was spiritual. Discipline, to avoid indulgence, to live humbly, and to focus on prayer. But when famine struck, austerity turned to hardship. The rules of moderation were tested by necessity, as food supplies dwindled and meals became thinner, poorer, and sometimes nearly absent. Most monasteries owned land, often donated by nobles seeking favor with God. These lands were worked by lay brothers, hired laborers, or even peasants living under monastic authority. Within the monastery walls, small gardens provided vegetables, herbs, and medicinal plants. In times of scarcity, these gardens became lifelines. Cabbage, leeks, onions, peas, and beans could be grown in small plots and stretched into soups. Herbs flavored otherwise bland meals. Fruit trees, apples, pears, plums, offered occasional relief from monotony. But gardens could not provide grain, the staple of every medieval diet. Bread was essential, and monasteries relied on surrounding estates or tithes from tenants to supply wheat, rye, or barley. When famine swept across regions, even monasteries with land struggled. Stores emptied, and bread grew scarce. Like castles and towns, monasteries maintained their own storehouses. Cellars held barrels of salted fish or meat. Granaries stored sacks of grain. Pantries kept wheels of cheese, jars of honey, and dried fruits. In good years, these stores provided security. But famine years drained reserves. Salted fish grew rancid. Grain rotted or became infested. Monks, tasked with rationing supplies, had to stretch dwindling stores across long months, never certain when relief would come. The daily act of distributing food, a cellarer handing out bread, a cook stirring the pot, became an exercise in calculation and restraint. Each portion had to be measured not only for the day but for the uncertain weeks ahead. Monks and nuns ate in common refectories, long halls with wooden tables where they sat side by side. Meals were taken in silence while one member of the community read aloud from Scripture or the lives of saints. During famine years, these silent meals took on new meaning. The sight of thinner loaves, of watery pottage, of smaller fish divided among many, was endured wordlessly. Hunger was borne collectively, with no complaint aloud, yet every monk felt it in his body. Imagine sitting in that refectory, the clatter of wooden spoons against bowls echoing off stone walls. The broth is thin, the bread coarse, the vegetables sparse. You eat in silence, listening to words about spiritual abundance while your stomach yearns for more. That was the rhythm of survival in monastic famine. Monasteries were not only communities unto themselves, they were also centers of charity. When famine struck, peasants often came to monastery gates seeking aid. For monks, this posed a moral dilemma: how much could be given away when their own stores were limited? Some monasteries opened their granaries, distributing food to the poor, believing that charity was part of their holy duty. Others, fearing starvation within, closed their gates. Chronicles record both outcomes: monasteries praised for feeding the hungry, and monasteries condemned for hoarding supplies. The tension between charity and survival weighed heavily. A loaf given away meant one less meal for a monk. Yet to refuse charity risked moral failure in the eyes of God. Within monastery walls, hunger was not only physical but spiritual. Every meal measured, every ration stretched, every act of charity debated. These were the daily struggles of monks in famine years. And it leaves us with a question: in times when hunger gnawed at the body, did the strict rules of the monastic diet offer strength through discipline, or did they deepen the pain of scarcity? When famine pressed against the walls of a monastery, it did not announce itself with drama. It crept slowly. First, loaves grew smaller, broth grew thinner, cellarers counted sacks more often, pacing storerooms with nervous eyes. By late winter, when gardens lay barren and last year's stores were nearly gone, hunger was no longer a distant possibility but a daily companion. And yet, monasteries endured. They endured through adaptation, through creative substitutions, and through rituals that transformed scarcity into spiritual practice. To trace their endurance is to see not only how they survived but how hunger itself became woven into the rhythms of religious life. The most immediate adaptation was to stretch what remained. Bakers mixed barley, oats, or even ground peas into bread to replace scarce wheat. These loaves were heavier, darker, and less pleasant to eat. Chroniclers describe bread that was coarse enough to break teeth or so sour it caused stomach pains. Yet such bread was considered a blessing compared to having no bread at all. Sometimes straw, chaff, or ground acorns were added, though these offered little nutrition. In desperate times, bread was baked from whatever could be milled into flour. The daily breaking of bread, once a steady ritual, became an act of invention. Pottage, the universal medieval dish of grains and vegetables boiled into a thick stew, was easily adapted to scarcity. In monasteries, cooks diluted the broth, turning thick stew into watery soup. Vegetables were stretched with wild herbs gathered from hedgerows. Nettles, sorrel, dandelion leaves, and other foraged greens found their way into the pot. Protein was rare. Fish, normally permitted in monastic diets, became scarce when rivers were overfished or salted stocks ran out. Beans and peas helped, but these too dwindled. The resulting soups filled bowls but not stomachs. Hunger lingered long after the meal ended. In monasteries that kept chickens or dairy animals, eggs, milk, and cheese could provide relief. But during famine, fodder for animals was scarce too. Cows gave less milk, chickens laid fewer eggs. Even these supplements grew unreliable. The cellarer, the monk responsible for provisions, often faced impossible choices. Should milk be saved for the sick? Should cheese wheels be cut now, or stored for a harsher season ahead? The rule of Benedict emphasized moderation, but famine demanded harsh calculation. Though monks were cloistered, they were not oblivious to the land around them. In famine years, foraging expeditions were organized. Brothers walked the edges of fields and forests, gathering edible plants. Mushrooms, roots, berries, and wild grains supplemented dwindling supplies. Sometimes foraging blurred into scavenging. Bark, moss, and even ground bones were recorded as famine food in some chronicles. To modern ears, these sound desperate, but for monks, each addition to the pot was a chance to stave off hunger for another day. Famine did not only reshape the menu, it reshaped the meaning of eating itself. Monks already practiced fasting as a spiritual discipline. Hunger was framed as a way to draw closer to God, to purify the soul, to imitate Christ's suffering. In times of famine, the line between chosen fasting and enforced hunger blurred. Meals that were meager by necessity were framed as opportunities for spiritual growth. Sermons and readings reminded monks that endurance of hunger was a holy trial. But while theology offered comfort, bodies still weakened. Monks grew thin. Some fainted during long prayers. Chroniclers record illnesses brought on by malnutrition. The body could not always match the aspirations of the spirit. The monastic refectory remained central even in famine. Meals were still taken in silence. Scriptures were still read aloud. The act of eating together, even when portions were small, reinforced unity. Some monasteries introduced special prayers during famine meals, asking God to multiply food as Christ had multiplied loaves and fishes. Others observed ritual fasts, deliberately going without food for a day so that their meager supplies would stretch further. The table became both a place of suffering and of solidarity, a reminder that no monk endured hunger alone. Scarcity forced difficult decisions about charity. Peasants still came to monastery gates, knocking with hollow faces and empty hands. Some abbots, fearing divine judgment, ordered that bread be distributed even when supplies ran low. Others closed gates, rationing only to those within. A few monasteries tried to balance both, offering smaller alms or feeding only children and the sick. But famine was relentless, and charity often meant choosing between compassion and survival. Records show monks agonizing over these choices, praying for guidance, and fearing both starvation and sin. Behind the stone walls, famine reshaped daily life in quiet ways. Monks prayed more fervently for rain. They counted days until the next harvest. They woke to weaker bodies, worked with slower hands, and slept with emptier stomachs. Hunger was not dramatic here, it was monotonous, lingering, wearing. It was felt in the scraping of bowls, in the thinning of belts, in the silence of brothers too weary to speak after meals. Adaptation sustained monasteries, but it did not erase suffering. Substitutions, rituals, and faith kept bodies alive and spirits focused, yet famine always left its mark. And so we must ask, when scarcity tested the balance between survival and spirituality, did monasteries truly triumph by endurance, or did hunger quietly erode both body and faith? When a famine finally loosened its grip, it did not vanish all at once. Relief came slowly, first in the faint greening of fields, then in cautious harvests, and finally in storerooms refilled with grain and legumes. For the monasteries, recovery was a season of both gratitude and reckoning. The years of scarcity had left behind frail bodies, altered habits, and memories not easily forgotten. As the first harvests after famine were gathered, monks often described the sight of full granaries as a divine gift. Barley, rye, and wheat poured into storage bins. Beans dried in rows. Cheese wheels began again to fill the shelves of cool cellars. But recovery was not immediate. Malnourished monks struggled to perform the heavy labor of harvest. Weakened immune systems made many vulnerable to illnesses. Some who had endured famine did not live long after it ended, their bodies too depleted to fully recover. For those who did survive, every loaf baked from the new grain seemed sweeter than any they had eaten before. Chroniclers note how monks wept at the first taste of fresh bread after years of substitutes. Eating returned, at least temporarily, to being not just survival but celebration. Many monasteries recorded their experiences in administrative notes, cellars accounts, or even marginal scribbles in manuscripts. These small records reveal practical lessons carried forward. Store more grain. Monasteries increased storage capacity, adding larger granaries or reinforcing cellars against damp. Diversify crops. Some encouraged planting of hardier grains, rye or oats, less vulnerable to poor harvests than wheat. Expand fish ponds. Fish ponds, already common, were enlarged or multiplied to ensure a steadier supply of protein. Foraging knowledge. Lists of edible wild plants sometimes appear in monastic writings, reflecting the survival value of herbal knowledge. In this way, famine imprinted itself onto the very rules and routines of monastic life. Hunger had been a teacher, and its lessons were codified into structures meant to endure. Theology did not ignore famine. Sermons described scarcity as a test, a divine chastisement, or a purification. Monks framed their survival as proof of God's providence. Yet some writings reveal quieter doubts. If God had tested them, why had so many children outside the monastery died? Why had brothers grown sick from hunger while praying for relief? These questions were rarely voiced openly, but famine left shadows even on faith. Nevertheless, gratitude became the dominant theme. Special feast days celebrated deliverance from famine. Prayers of thanksgiving were added to daily liturgies. The memory of hunger was woven into spiritual practice, not as a wound, but as a reminder of dependence on divine provision. Interestingly, some famine substitutions lingered. Monks continued to eat coarse breads of mixed grains even when wheat was plentiful, partly from habit, partly from preference for simplicity. Certain foraged herbs, once survival food, remained in pottage recipes, their bitterness a quiet echo of hard times. What had been born of necessity sometimes became tradition. Austerity foods, barley loaves, simple vegetable broths, were framed as spiritually virtuous even after famine. In this way, scarcity reshaped taste itself, blurring the line between endurance and devotion. After surviving famine, many monasteries recommitted themselves to charity. Chronicles note increased almsgiving in the years following scarcity, as if the memory of want deepened compassion. Some abbots ordered that surplus grain always be stored for the poor. Others built new hospices or expanded bread distribution at the gates. Not all monasteries did so, some grew cautious, storing more for themselves against future hardship. Yet across Europe, famine forced monasteries to reconsider their relationship with surrounding communities. Hunger had revealed the fragile thread binding cloister and village. In some monasteries, famine left physical marks. Granaries were enlarged, storehouses rebuilt, and inscriptions carved to remind future generations of past want. In manuscripts, monks copied accounts of famine, inserting them alongside theological texts. These records were not dramatic tales. They were quiet notes of numbers, so many sacks of grain lost, so many days of fasting enforced, so many brothers weakened. But in their very dullness, they speak volumes. They show how hunger was not extraordinary but part of the fabric of medieval life. For the monks, endurance through famine became part of their collective identity. They were not only men of prayer and learning but men who had suffered together, who had known hunger and survived by discipline, ingenuity, and faith. This endurance shaped how monasteries were seen by others. Peasants, who often endured worse, still viewed monasteries as places of order in a chaotic world. The stone walls seemed to promise stability, even when those inside had eaten loaves of acorns and herbs to survive. Looking back, one sees that the forgotten diets of monks during scarcity were not merely about food. They were about resilience, adaptation, and meaning-making in the face of unavoidable hardship. They reveal how human beings, when stripped of plenty, reframe necessity as virtue and survival as holiness. When modern readers imagine medieval monasteries, they often picture abundance, vast kitchens, overflowing ale barrels, rich feasts on holy days. But famine tells another story, of broth stretched thin, of herbs gathered from hedgerows, of prayers whispered over half-empty bowls. The legacy of monastic hunger is quiet but enduring. It reminds us that scarcity shapes memory as much as abundance, that the foods we eat in desperation can become symbols of devotion, and that endurance is often built not on dramatic heroism but on the patient stretching of loaves, the foraging of nettles, and the strength to pray through hunger. And so, we might wonder, in our own times of abundance and waste, what lessons might still be drawn from the silent, stoic endurance of those monks who once survived famine behind cloister walls.